Okay, so we're delighted to welcome here today for Professor Marc Hight's keynote lecture. Marc is coming to us from Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia, USA. He is joining the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies in September, I believe, late September, as a visiting professor. So Marc Hight specializes in early modern philosophy and is published widely in this area. He is the author of Idea and Ontology, published in 2008 by Penn State, and The Correspondence of George Berkeley, published by Cambridge University Press. Marc will talk today on the topic of an 18th century Catholic Enlightenment in Ireland. So I'll hand it over to yourself now, Marc.
Okay, brilliant. Let me get my thing moving. So I'd like to start by first expressing my appreciation to Ian and Trish and Carly and the rest of the staff for organizing a brilliant first conference, and perhaps even more so for being kind enough to invite me to be a participant. And I'm very pleased to be here. I guess I'll start with a quick introduction that on following the general principle that no one ever really wants to hear a philosopher read for long periods of time. I'm going to do my presentation slightly extemporaneously, and I'm going to cut a lot out of this rather large paper. And so I hope you will forgive me a bit for that as we go. So with the title like a Catholic Enlightenment in 18th century Ireland, you might think it's a very hopeful topic, but in fact, I'm going to be answering this question in the negative. And basically, my thesis is fairly straightforward. It's not really about the Enlightenment per se, but it's about how scholars, from philosophers to historians to social scientists and literature scholars, wield their concepts when they engage a variety of different topics, and in this case, in particular, the Enlightenment. So really,
Marc, I think you've muted yourself.
Yes, I have. Okay, so how much of that did we miss?
Just a second or two.
Okay, very good. So what I'm bringing to you today then is rather, instead of sort of a historical analysis, it's rather a warning to conceptual care. So we ought not to eviscerate our concepts when we engage, again, in philosophy and history and literature and whatnot. And so just as you ought not to run with scissors, one ought not to eviscerate one's concepts. One of two ways. It can happen because our concepts are too profligate or too narrow. So too profligate is to apply a concept to everything that we possibly can or everything that we want. So I know that I also suffer from this upon occasion. I study 18th century philosophy in particular, among other things. I'm a Berkeley scholar, and I just really want Berkeley to get things right. And I want Berkeley to sort of look good. And so I might then err on the side of being a bit too profligate by applying concepts to Berkeley that I want him to have. I want him to be an enlightener. I want a variety of things to happen. Unfortunately, when you do that, you tend to, well, eviscerate the concept. So in particular, what it means is that we lose a sense of explanatory power. If every adult male Catholic in Ireland in the 18th century was an enlightener, then learning that a particular person, an O'Connor, a Taft, a Hooke, or what have you, is an enlightener doesn't actually explain very much. Now, on the opposite end, we can be too narrow with our concept use, right? If it turns out that we want to take a concept, for instance, of an enlightener or the Enlightenment, and make it so circumscribed and narrow that it just becomes sort of pointing to a historical date, that's also not going to be very useful. So what I'm trying to do is we're trying to avoid this loss of explanatory power in these particular cases. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, the principal way, at least those of us in philosophy, is by generating what we call a contrast class. And so a contrast class is exactly what it sounds like. It's a class of things that provide the contrast to the concept that we are engaging. So a very good way of thinking about this is through sort of a pretty clear example, I think, which is self-interestedness. I do some work in the philosophy of economics, and my colleagues in economics departments and other social sciences tell me that one of the things that's very important to explain behavior of individuals is to note that they're self-interested. But self-interestedness is a concept, however, that frequently lacks a contrast. So for instance, let's say that I wonder why Trish Kiernan came to my talk today. And an economist might say, well, it's because she believed it was in her self-interest to arrive, because she was interested in the topic, or perhaps she has to because she's the organizer of the conference. But per impossible, if we turned around and let's say she hadn't come, and then we ask, well, why didn't she attend the talk? Well, the answer might be, well, she had more important things to do, tend to her dogs, or whatever the case might be, and she would have done so because she judged that it was not in her self-interest. But in that case, it turns out that if she attends or if she doesn't attend, it's entirely up to self-interestedness. That means describing her as self-interested doesn't actually explain anything. And so therein lies the problem, because it lacks a contrast class. So now I want to turn to the putative topic, which would be the Enlightenment. Might we be in danger of eviscerating the concept of the Enlightenment through profligate use? And I want to suggest that the answer is probably yes. So as David Dwan writes in his review of Michael Brown's book, The Irish Enlightenment, enlightenments are 2 a penny these days. It's sort of a nice turn of phrase. And he's not wrong, I think. We can think, when we think about enlightenment, so when I first started studying many decades ago, when I thought of the Enlightenment, I thought of some primary figures, perhaps in Britain, in France, maybe a few in Germany. We had a relatively well sort of characterized sense of this. But today, of course, the Enlightenment has spread in the literature seriously. We now have national enlightenments. I have read, for instance, about the Portuguese Enlightenment, the Polish Enlightenment, the Italian Enlightenment, even the Irish Enlightenment. But further than that, there are now religious enlightenments that are placed as well. So, for instance, there's a Catholic Enlightenment, and even various Protestant denominations. There's a Presbyterian Enlightenment, and so forth and so on. And to extend this, perhaps even more radically, we now have individuals arguing that there are local enlightenments. Here's a nice turn from Tom O'Connor in his article on Joseph Hook, where he writes that through the intellectual activity of the Irish, the Scots, and English scholastics who wrote in the Catholic heartlands, local Catholic enlightenments added to the movement's intellectual force and range. Now, of course, one wonders to what intellectual movements O'Connor is referring, and this is what we need to explore in order to have a sense of this. Okay, so I've given you my introduction. Let me give you sort of a plan. I want to start by articulating 2 concepts of the Enlightenment, sort of the traditional Kantian conception, sort of considered the core conception, and then the more recent conception of a Catholic Enlightenment. And we're going to use this just as a baseline. It doesn't matter the particular details of which conception of the Enlightenment you use. Again, remember, this is a warning to conceptual care. It's not a defense of a particular interpretation of the Enlightenment. I then want to turn to use these as a baseline to analyze some Irish examples. Then hopefully, if there's any time, I'll consider some objections, and then hopefully we can have some discussion. So let us talk about the tasty Enlightenment pie, because everybody wants a piece of this, right? And of course, when I think of the tasty Enlightenment pie, I think of chocolate cream, because I confess to have a bit of a weakness for chocolate. So let's talk Kant. And so here's one of my little favorite caricatures of Kant. So Kant very famously described the motto of the Enlightenment as sapere aude, right? Seize wisdom. And he characterizes it with sort of 3 large groups. That enlighteners seek out reasoned answers, so there's sort of a principled dependence upon reason. They do not rely upon traditional authorities, whether that's secular, but also especially religious. And of course, it's committed to a form of toleration, particularly religious toleration, although I would argue the concept is broader. And so the enlightener, according to Kant, is someone who's sort of becoming mature as an intellect. And he writes in a nice turn of phrase at the beginning of his essay on what is enlightenment: immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without guidance of another. Now, I want to sort of be clear, there's nothing particularly controversial about this, right? And so I give you a quick excerpt from Jim Smith's article on Wolfe Tone's library. The concept of enlightenment then is now linked routinely with greater religious toleration, deism, and the privileging of reason over revelation and authority. And this comes in an article where he's arguing that there's an Irish Catholic enlightenment in the sense that there are Irish Catholic enlighteners. So he's not unaware of sort of the core concept, right? He is, as it were, stretching the concept. So inside of this, lots of people argue that, again, inside the core conception of enlightenment, that religious toleration is perhaps one, if not the central sort of feature of the Enlightenment. And so John Marshall, in his influential book on Locke, writes that religious toleration was the central value of this early Enlightenment. Well, if that's the case, one might be initially worried when we want to talk about something like a Catholic Enlightenment. After all, I mean, can you imagine sort of a devout 18th century Catholic who's interested in resisting traditional authority, even to the extent of systematically questioning the authority of Rome? Well, I might be skeptical. But that doesn't mean that there isn't room for a legitimate and robust conception of a Catholic Enlightenment. What we need is a narrower bound that still gives us that contrast class. Now, today I'm going to argue that there is a meaningful concept of a Catholic Enlightenment. And in fact, it's because I believe that there's that meaningful concept that I argue that an Irish Catholic Enlightenment doesn't make sense. Well, perhaps the most famous of the defenses of a concept of a Catholic Enlightenment comes from Ulrich Lehner and Michael Prenti, who emphasized the dual concepts of renewal and reform inside the Catholic Church. So let's explore this a bit. So the argument is that the contrast class was not sort of enlighteners that were questioning all traditional authority, but individuals within the Catholic Church, within the Catholic tradition, that were interested in a reasoned reform. Now, at this point, then we would have to ask, is there a contrast class? And of course, there is. We're quite well aware in the 18th century of a great many thinkers and other figures, whether in the church or political figures, who were fideistic or were not interested in the primacy of reason or the so-called middle way of reason, and for instance, who weren't willing to question any of the dictates of the church in this sort of sense. So we do have something that answers to a contrast class. And so here Prenti talks a little bit about this flowering of a Catholic Enlightenment that was done in this sense of Reformed Catholicism. Okay, so I want to argue that a concept of a religious enlightenment, in particular a Catholic Enlightenment, is meaningful and important. So to sort of characterize that concept, I want to appeal to something that's perhaps a little more analytic about it. And David Sorokin's concept of religious enlighteners, I think, does this quite well. So he invokes, based upon sort of a broader sense, I'm going to narrow it to renewal and reform, but he argues there are four key features that can help us to describe religious enlighteners. They search for what he calls a middle way. So we're not going to sort of remove faith or appeals to wondrousness, for instance, in miracles, but we're going to temper that with reasonable belief. And in particular, we're going to want to avoid contradiction. We are importantly going to embrace toleration very broadly, including religious toleration. He's going to emphasize the centrality of the public sphere and the fact that the views that we embrace both within and without the church are publicly available. And then he also adds stuff about state sponsorship and a state church that's it's going to be a little less important to my particular analysis. But at this point, you might stop and say, but Hight, why not call this a Catholic reform movement? Why call this a Catholic enlightenment? Well, sort of my quick answer is that because an enlightenment is a tasty pie and a reform movement isn't quite as sexy, as it were. And so there's something to be gained from that in and of itself. But I actually want to take the additional step to say that it makes sense to draw our conceptual lines between religious enlighteners who were committed to questioning authority and to emphasizing reason in limited, important ways, but nevertheless produce a contrast. So I argue that a Catholic Enlightenment makes good sense as a concept, provided, and this is sort of the point of the talk, that we're not profligate in its use. So you might also say, well, aren't there other concepts of the Enlightenment? You mentioned Kant, which is sort of a very stolid, old conception. Sure, you talk about a Catholic Enlightenment, but maybe we could characterize other Enlightenments. And my response is absolutely. Please do. I'm not wedded to any particular conception of the Enlightenment. What I'm arguing is that whatever we use, it must not be profligate. So in other words, we must have a very clear, well-managed contrast class to make this useful. So I think that Catholic Enlighteners could be enlightened thinkers. I think many of them were. But what's excluded by the concept of enlightened in the context of Ireland in particular? And here's where I get to sort of the meat of the discussion. I want to argue that perhaps we've lost a bit of our conceptual way. Well, you be the judge. So the Irish context. So I start with an interesting excerpt from Mario Rosa, who's got an article in the Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment on Roman Catholicism. And he says that the Catholic Enlightenment was a composite and contradictory movement. It was characterized by the dual tension of cultural dynamism and a commitment to apologetics. But one wonders, if it was so contradictory, why would you then claim that it falls underneath the umbrella of the Enlightenment? I mean, that sort of muddies the waters a bit. Well, so what I want to do now is I want to take a look at a couple of specific examples of individuals who have been advanced as Irish Catholic Enlighteners, a sort of more general overview example, and argue that we're in dangerous waters. But before I do that, I want to be really clear. Was there an Enlightenment in Ireland? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? But it was predominantly an Enlightenment of the Protestant ascendancy, at least in the 18th century. Is there a Catholic Enlightenment? And the answer is absolutely yes, right? The concept is quite clear. But an Irish Catholic Enlightenment, I think we have to sort of answer no. Now, I have quite a bit to say about why that's the case, and I don't think we have time to discuss that too much here, so I'll just give you a quick taste. I feel a bit odd talking a little bit about Irish history with so many erudite historians that I believe are in the audience, so hopefully you'll be generous. But basically, my view is pretty straightforward. But since even before the Battle of Aughrim in 1691, which I think sort of represents the destruction of Catholic political authority in Ireland, and even despite the reign of James II, who was King of England first and Catholic monarch second, that what we find in Ireland in the 18th century is a very unusual history, right? We have the history of the dominant population of the island who were laboring under an oppressive environment, not just politically and religiously, but culturally. And as a result of this, whether it was economic, whether it was political, whether it was cultural, there's not enough room for a robust concept of Irish Catholic Enlighteners because they weren't given that room as they were, for instance, elsewhere. So let's take a look at some specific examples. I'm going to look at them for particular reasons. So Thomas O'Connor, in his article on Joseph Hook, argues that this Irish-born priest, historian, and theologian represents an excellent example of an Irish Catholic Enlightener. As he writes that Hook adroitly wove Newton and Locke into his theological discourses. Now, I'm not exactly clear that simply mentioning and engaging Newton and Locke in his theological discourses is sufficient to count him as an enlightener, or even a Catholic enlightener in particular. But that's not really what I want to emphasize with the case of Hook, because Hook is a representative example for me of a fair number of individuals who don't qualify, I think, as good candidates, because like many of their educated brethren, he wasn't educated in Ireland, and he didn't actually do any of his intellectual work in Ireland. Hook left Ireland in 1734 at the old age of 20, and he never returned, right? He became sort of eventually a fairly prominent figure in France, Interestingly, or at least interestingly to me, I just recently found out that he was on the board in France that censured Rousseau's Emile later in the century. So the issue then is, it's odd to count Hooke as an Irish enlightener if in fact his environment, as it were, wasn't actually Ireland. Okay, and if it was, then one wonders, if those who immigrated count as Irish enlighteners, then what about the Irish who went to the American colonies in the 18th century? Right? To my knowledge, there's not a single Irish immigrant who is claimed as a member of the Irish Catholic Enlightenment, despite my survey of the literature. And if anybody knows better, I would really, really appreciate you letting me know. So in this particular case, I think Hooke, who is at least claimed by O'Connor to be a Catholic Irish Enlightener, isn't. Not because he's not Irish and not because he's not Catholic, but because he wasn't both when he was, as it were, being an enlightener. The next of the figures I want to engage here quickly is Charles O'Connor. So James Livesey, in his, actually it's a really nice article on the fall of Catholic Cosmopolitan, argues that the O'Connors and the Nugents and the Tafts and the Hookes all formed this sort of cosmopolitan core of the Irish Catholic Enlightenment. But when we turn to look more deeply into why he believes that's the case, right, is what justifies his application of the concept of enlightener to this Irish Catholic. Well, he gives us 4 reasons. The first 3 are a bit odd. He says that he corresponded with Samuel Johnson, that he was interested in Irish national history, and that he had access to the networks of Enlightenment sociability. Well, these 3 points together seem to indicate that Livesey might believe that O'Connor was an Irish Catholic enlightener as if it were by friction, right, by rubbing up against some of those individuals. And I mean, you know, it's a fair point and it's an interesting point, but I'm not sure it constitutes a very persuasive argument as to why this particular concept would apply. But he does provide extended analysis about why he believes that O'Connor, as someone who pursued religious toleration and reconciliation with Britain, ought to be considered a Catholic enlightener. And here I want to suggest that the use of being an enlightener is in fact a bit profligate. Now, Smith is absolutely right, Livesey, my apologies, that O'Connor was interested in promoting religious toleration and supported the British Crown. He wrote both privately and publicly in defense of these over a great many years. Not a doubt. But you have to ask why, right? What does O'Connor think he's doing? And the answer is going to be a little disappointing, right? So O'Connor argues quite clearly that Catholics should promote British civilization because Protestantism, Anglicanism in particular, is culturally self-defeating. So let me give you a quote that even Livesey gives. This is a quote of a letter from O'Connor. And he writes that Arianism is making great progress and deism is making noise. The established religion is only preserved by its exterior forms. Even Bishop Berkeley declared that this will end in popery, and I trust his prediction will be verified. What you find if you read O'Connor sort of carefully with a neutral eye about how these things are working is not somebody who's interested in promoting religious toleration as a principle. Okay? He's not seeking pious renewal and reform within Catholicism. Even conciliation was only a route to emancipating Catholic Ireland, right? So Connor was interested in replacing an intolerant Protestant ascendancy with an intolerant Catholic ascendancy. And so I would argue this does not make him an enlightener. Just because we use the words toleration and conciliation is not sufficient. So you might say, well, might we have not sort of a wider spread? And the best sort of bird's eye view of what's going on, I think, is Michael Brown's book, his very large book on the Irish Enlightenment that came out a few years ago. Now, Michael's book has large, well-developed chapters on the Protestant Enlightenments, right? For instance, he has a separate chapter on the Presbyterian Enlightenment. There's a lot of good work there. I learned a lot from reading it. But if you look at the chapter on the Catholic Enlightenment, it's a very odd chapter. I mean, first, the overwhelming proportion of the chapter is a discussion of Catholic poetry and literature and other traditional Catholic figures. In fact, he even introduces the chapter with the quote that I've reproduced on the right. So in contrast to the Anglican community, the consequence of the War of Two Kings was an immense psychological pressure caused by military defeat and cultural repression. And the response, paradoxically, was to fall back on traditional verities. But falling back on traditional verities is demonstrably not any of the basic conceptions that we have of an enlightenment or of an enlightener. So he does talk about, in particular, he highlights rather two individuals, Cornelius Neri, who was a Dublin priest. But even here, Brown does not claim that he was an Enlightenment figure. At best, the closest we get is he says that he appropriated aspects of the Enlightenment project. Okay, well, that's a pretty weak claim, and there's not much analysis of the actual claims that Neri makes in terms of endorsing a principled toleration or talking about the middle course of reason. The best that he gets in terms of advancing an explicit claim of someone who would count as an Irish Catholic enlightener was Bernard O'Connor. But O'Connor is a very interesting choice because O'Connor converted to Anglicanism near the end of his life. He changed his name. And for the last several decades of his life, he was perhaps best known for his slew of fairly virulent anti-Catholic views. So Bernard O'Connor, no doubt, was Irish, but I'm not sure how Catholic one would want to count Connor despite his birthright. So in summary, in the one major work that provides a very comprehensive overview of the Irish Catholic Enlightenment, it just doesn't. Now, again, I want to be very clear. Yes, there was an Irish Enlightenment, absolutely. And no doubt these faces are going to be very familiar to everyone, right? Swift, of course, my own favorite, Berkeley and Burke. But these are all members of the Protestant ascendancy. There are also other members we should count, like Hutchinson, who was an Irishman who went to Scotland, and he's roundly considered a part of the Scottish Enlightenment. So yes, there's an Irish Enlightenment. Yes, there's a Catholic Enlightenment. But it's precisely because we want to preserve the explanatory power of both concepts that we need to sort of carefully look when we make the specific claim about Ireland. And I think in order to preserve that explanatory power, we need to say no. So very quickly, I wanted to limit this to 25 to 30 minutes. And I'm just about there. So I just want to talk very quickly about some possible objections. So one objection that I've received already is that Hight, this conception of the Enlightenment, is far too narrow. It's far too narrow. You've got it. It's completely uncharitable. And my response is to repeat what I hopefully have said enough times to let this be clear. It doesn't matter. I don't really care which concept of the Enlightenment that you want to employ. I am very happy to accept a variety of different conceptions of the Enlightenment. But when I read a variety of these figures in philosophy and in history and in literature, I find that they're wielding conceptions of enlightenment in ways about which they're not at all clear. And as a result, the explanatory power of their attributions of someone being an enlightener doesn't actually advance our understanding. And that's where I'm really concerned. And I think, given that we started a bit late and where we are, I think at that point, I will draw this to a close. I will just say thank you. And please take that last line on the slide seriously, that I invite email correspondence and criticisms, please. So to questions and to discussion.